What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I am super excited to be bringing you part 6 of my Middle-earth review series, otherwise known as the finale to this series, because today we are going to be talking about the final film in the Lord of the Rings saga, and that is The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King. One of the best films ever made, very deserved of all of the Oscars that it received, and is personally my favorite film of all time. Now, just because I love it does not mean it is a perfect film, and just because I believe it is near perfect doesn't mean that it is perfect. So I do have a few negatives, but they are mostly very minor things, so I like to bring these up at the beginning of the video so that I can start praising it to the heavens. So, there's one small thing that I noticed on this rewatch that I've never noticed before. When Aragorn and the team arrive at the Black Gates of Mordor to draw away Sauron's focus from Frodo and Sam, they ride in on horses, and they confront the mouth of Sauron, then they return to the rest of the army, and then it cuts back to Frodo and then back to them, and they're all standing on foot. Like, the horses they were on disappeared. Now, I don't know if that has something to do with the fact that they couldn't keep the horses and they were shooting on 2 separate days or something, but it just stuck out to me on this rewatch. It's like, what happened to their horses? What? Like, and it's not something like in the extended cut they let the horses go or something. It's like just a weird inconsistency that I noticed. It doesn't break the movie, you know, it's not that bad of a thing, but it's just something that I noticed that I haven't noticed before. It's just kind of a weird little inconsistency there. I don't know what's behind that, but just kind of a weird little thing I figured I'd point out. And then, kind of another thing relating to Aragorn, I know this played out differently in the book, because from what I remember in the book, he actually told, the people of Rohan where he was going, and he was going to recruit people to help them in the battle. In the film, of course, he goes into the Paths of the Dead and tries to recruit the former kings and hold them to fulfill their oath and assist them in, protecting Gondor. And I believe that it plays out similarly in the book, but I think he does tell them where he's going. And it does feel weird in the context of the movie that he just kind of makes everyone believe that he's leaving out of cowardice, and he's just kind of abandoning them, and it's just kind of weird. Like, it's not a big deal, it's a really minor thing, but it's kind of weird because if I recall, it did play out differently in the book. Although perhaps I'm mistaken, it's just kind of a weird little detail where he just kind of like makes everyone believe that he's abandoning them, and they're all like, Aragorn, what a dick. And it's just kind of like, wait, what? Like, it's a small thing. Bothers me probably more than it should, but I just figured I'd mention it. And then, towards the end of the movie, after we have the epic conclusion with the destruction of the ring, we have arguably the cheesiest scene in the entire series. Frodo wakes up in a bed in Rivendell, or maybe it's Minas Tirith, I don't know. And he just sees Gandalf, and then goes, Gandalf, like a baby, and then, everyone just walks in, and then Merry and Pippin start jumping on the bed, and everyone's laughing, and it's just such a cheesy scene. In a film full of fantastic scenes that are very powerful and poignant, it's just one example where it's like they really missed the mark on that. It just feels so cringeworthy and like memeable. Like, there's so many dubs and memes that have been created about that scene, and it's very meme-worthy. It's basically just a meme. And I feel like, a reunion between our characters is a reasonable thing to want to include, but the way it was executed in the film is just terrible. It's just such a terrible scene. It's such a stupid sequence, and considering that it's one scene in like 100 that are fantastic, it doesn't break the movie or anything, but it is kind of worth mentioning because of how stupid it is. And then at the very end of the movie, Elijah Wood starts narrating kind of towards I'd say in the epilogue section of the film, and something about his lines sound weird. They sound like Elijah Wood, recorded his lines in a metal box or something. Like, it just sounds weird. The way that they've been sound mixed sounds weird. Like, Cate Blanchett, Galadriel, narrated the opening to The Fellowship of the Ring, and it sounded fine. I don't know if it's just Elijah Wood's poor narrating skills, or maybe they added some effect on it, but just something about the sound mixing or something, it just doesn't sound right. It sounds weird. It just stuck out to me throughout the entire thing. It's not a deal breaker. It's just kind of a little small thing I figured I'd mention. And then the last thing I want to bring up is a very small thing. It's not really a bad thing or a good thing. It's just something I figured I'd mention, is that There's a very large change from the source material in this film where the Fellowship, I suppose, our team, they basically go to Isengard at the beginning of the movie to confront Saruman. Now, in the book, that plays out the same, but they don't kill him, they just kind of lock him up. And then, towards the end of the movie, the hobbits just return, and the Shire is just like they left it. But in the book, the hobbits return, and everything's been messed up. The Shire has just been completely overtaken, and you find out that Saruman is behind it. And in the movie, they weirdly have the death of Saruman play out the same way that it does at that point in the book. Basically, Frodo tries to show kind of compassion towards Saruman, even though Frodo wasn't with them in the movie version. But basically, Saruman gets betrayed by his own underling, he gets stabbed, and then Grima, his underling, gets shot with an arrow. It plays out the same way, but just at a different point in the story. And it's not a deal breaker or anything, but just kind of the way it plays out feels a little bit awkward because they never established that Saruman was kind of mean to his underling before. Like, he's obviously an evil guy, but they never really played up that he was, like, abusive to his underling. But then in this scene, he just goes, "Cur!" and, like, slaps him, and it kind of just feels, like, awkward because they had to establish really quickly that he, like, is distasteful or acts distastefully towards his underling, and thus motivates him to stab him. In the book, there was more of a slow build-up, but in the film, it feels a little bit awkward because they had to establish in this one scene that he's, acts distastefully towards this character, and then have that character kill him off. But in the book, there was more build-up to it. So, it's not a deal-breaker. It doesn't ruin the movie for me. It's weird that it was cut out of the theatrical version because it's only in the extended cut, but what can you do? That's about all I have to say in regards to negatives about this film. Let's get into praising it to the heavens. Now, getting into the positives for this film, I figured I'd just mention how well it pays off all of the development for these characters. One character I feel in particular that they really do a good job paying off is the character of Pippin. You got to see at the end of The Two Towers that Pippin was finally starting to understand the severity of the conflict, but in this film he really comes into his own. He saves Gandalf at one point, and they have a nice subtle way of showing his character growth, which is that in earlier films his clumsiness would be to the detriment of the characters. Like in the first film, he knocks a skeleton down into the mines of Moria, thus alerting the orcs to their presence. But in this film, he brings out the Palantir that they got from Isengard and starts looking at it, and he sees Sauron, but he's ultimately able to actually glean information from it, unintentionally of course, but does glean information and finds out kind of Sauron's next step of his plan, and, alerts them to the fact that Saruman is going to strike at Gondor next. So there's just a nice subtle way of showing his character progression and growth, and, the way that he swears his loyalty and his service to Denethor, the Steward of Gondor, really does highlight how mature he has become, because that comes out of a sense of, nobility and owing this person because Boromir laid down his life for him. It just shows the character growth of Pippin, and I really like that a lot. And just all the characters in this film really do come to the logical conclusions, and their development is paid off here. Like, we all deserve a friend as good as Samwise Gamgee. He's the most loyal person, and despite Frodo basically pushing him away, he comes back and faces down the giant spider, on his own, and it's just the most badass thing ever. And then he climbs to the top of this tower to rescue his friend, and fights off, every orc. It's crazy. He's such a courageous character. And it shows the true progression of his character. This person at the beginning who was kind of scared to step away from home, and now is willing to face down some of the most dark threats within Middle-earth to protect his friend. It's just fantastic. It's so well done. And, you also have the character of Aragorn, who, in my mind, is honestly the real Lord of the Ring. Or Lord of the Rings, I suppose. Because if you think about it, he's the only person who is never corrupted by the ring. Every other character that tries to take the ring from Frodo, or that Frodo offers the ring to, is afraid or is either corrupted by it. Is either corrupted by it or afraid of how the ring could corrupt them. Even Sam, when he takes the ring for a short amount of time, is still reluctant to give it back to Frodo. He ultimately does, but he's reluctant to do so. Aragorn is the only character that is never corrupted by it. In the first film, when Frodo, offers to give him the ring or whatever, and he shows him the ring, he just closes his hand around it, and he doesn't give in to the temptation of the ring. And then towards the end of the movie, you kind of have this scene where Sauron is talking to Aragorn, and they're at the Black Gate, and he starts walking slowly towards him, and you believe that perhaps he's giving in to the temptation and lies of Sauron, but he just turns around and goes for Frodo. And he's the real Lord of the Rings. He's the only one that was able to conquer the rings above all else. And he was the character that was afraid of falling down, or falling into the trappings of his former ancestors. He didn't want to become the king throughout this entire trilogy because he was afraid of becoming like his ancestor Isildur, who failed to destroy the ring. His character arc is great. This film is his movie in many ways, and I feel like he's a great character. And I feel like that was a much needed aspect to be added, was the element of his reluctance to become king. Because if I'm remembering correctly in the book, he was more enthusiastic about becoming king than he was in the films. In the films, he just really doesn't want to do it. He's afraid of it, basically. But then he takes up that responsibility, and you see he very much is the correct person to be on the throne. He's the one person who is never corrupted by the ring for even a second. Even these other characters that are very gracious and good at heart, like Faramir, they are still corrupted by the ring at a certain point for their own individual reasons. Aragorn never gives into the temptation of the ring, and he is, at least in my mind, the real, Lord of the Rings. And then, just all these other characters as well, like Faramir. It's just tragic to see how horrible of a person his father is, that he sends him out to basically commit suicide by going into the freaking Orc Armada with his tiny group of soldiers. But he's willing to do so because he just hopes that in death, his father will fully appreciate him, because he knows his father will never appreciate him in life. It's so sad. You feel terrible for this guy, because he's such a warm individual. He's such a good guy at heart. And you know that he is, from watching him, you know that he is a better person than Boromir was. But his father is just this corrupt, terrible person in the seat of power. And that's an important role, John Noble does a great job portraying Denethor, because he's a very important character. He has to provide that juxtaposition to Aragorn's leadership, and you have to see why it's very important that Aragorn takes up that role, because he's kind of in a similar position Denethor is, and he's just this completely corrupt person in a seat of power. And then you have Éowyn, who I talked about in the last video, and then she and Faramir get together, and that's only briefly shown in the extended cut of this film. But they, work well together as a couple. Like, it's appropriate that those two end up together, because they are very similar in many ways. She felt restricted by being forced into just not being able to fight, people thinking of her as not a soldier, not a fighter, and he kind of recognizes that within her, and he also felt, mistreated and unloved by his father. So you can understand why those two would end up together. But I really want to talk about the scene where Éowyn takes out the Witch King, because that is such a fantastic scene, and it works so well. And I want to explain why. Because a lot of people have this weird misconception. I think a lot of studios nowadays try to copy that scene. Because that is how you do a girl power scene, so to speak, right. That is how you do that correctly. Because it is based off the source material, but it's because it's an amplification of Tolkien's themes. Earlier in the film, the character Éomer, who is her brother, another rider of Gondor, basically says that she knows nothing of war, and neither does Merry, the hobbit. He's like, that hobbit's going to give in to the screams and, the spoils of war, and he's going to run away like a coward. But you see that she and Merry, these two characters, are the ones that take down one of the most ultimate threats in the series, the Witch King of Angmar. So Merry stabs him, and then gives Éowyn the opening she needs to take him out. And the reason why that scene works, I Am No Man takes out the Witch King, is because it's an amplification and reinforcement of Tolkien's thesis for the entire series, which is that It's the small things that keep evil at bay. That is why that is so important. It's not because it's a girl power scene. So many studios nowadays fail to realize why that scene worked, and I feel like every studio now tries to copy that. Like for freaking Endgame, where they have the scene where all the girls, all the women start walking together or whatever. It feels so cheap and disingenuous, because you can tell the studios just looked at, Eowyn from Lord of the Rings and were like, oh, we need to appeal to women, so we have to have the girl power scene. And they didn't even put any thought into it, and it feels like this completely disingenuous, corny, stupid moment. It's terrible. But no scene, in my opinion, has really ever come close to Eowyn's takedown of the Witch King. It's such a satisfying scene. It's awesome. Such a badass moment. And that is why it works so well. Because it's not because it's a girl power moment. It's because it's a moment that kind of can inspire anyone. It's a moment that refers to Tolkien's themes, because it's not just her, it's Mary as well. It's the small things that keep evil at bay. That's why it works, not because it's girl power. People misunderstand that. That's why that works so well. That's why that's such a fantastic scene, because it's a reinforcement of the themes. It has a thematic purpose. It's not just a forced-in, disingenuous moment to try and add some representation, which is just fake, That's why that scene works so well. And, just even smaller characters like Legolas and Gimli, two characters that at the beginning were kind of prejudiced against each other, are now going to stand together in the final battle of Middle-earth, and Gimli says, oh man, I never thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf. And Legolas looks down at him and says, what about side by side with a friend? And then that's just such a great tiny moment, but it reinforces the full arc that these two characters have gone through together. These two characters of opposing races that were prejudiced against each other and are now going to face down the ultimate evil of Middle-earth together, side by side as friends. It's such a simple moment, but just works so well and reinforces those themes. And even Elrond kind of has a little bit of an arc, because in the first film, they showed how he was distrusting of men, and he was like, the world of men fell when Isildur failed to throw the ring into the fire. But when he brings the sword to Aragorn, he says, I have faith in men. And it shows that even he has gone through a little bit of a transformation as a character throughout these films. It's so well done. Every character has an arc in some form. And, this film is basically the culmination of all their development. And I can't think of any other, conclusionary piece to a series where they actually pull that off. Where every single character has a satisfying conclusion to their arc. I can't think of that. Even movies that people like, they always point to, oh, but this was bad. Like, even people who like freaking Endgame or whatever, they're like, okay, yeah, the Hulk was bad. Or, okay, yeah, Thor was bad. But these characters' conclusions were good. I can't think of a single character's conclusion in The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King that wasn't satisfying or worked well. And that's just a testament to how much effort and thought was put into crafting these films. Now that I've talked about this film's character work and why it works so well on a character level, I figured I might as well talk about it on a technical level and how well constructed it is. Just from the opening, you have the scene at the very beginning of the film, just opening it with this flashback to the corruption of Smeagol at the hands of the ring. And then from that point on, you just have this slow buildup of dread, because you feel like Sauron's force is so overwhelming. They're going to take over Gondor. Rohan's there, but their force is only like a quarter of Sauron's army. But that just makes the moments of victory all the more satisfying, because there's so many moments in this film, and I talked about this briefly, in my Fellowship of the Ring review with Boromir's sacrifice and him just, fighting, knowing he has no chance of survival, but, just continuing to fight to give others more time. And in this film, you just have so many satisfying moments like that, like Rohan arriving at Minas Tirith to just fight off Sauron's force, knowing that they're probably going to die, but that they have to make this last stand. They're not going to sit around. They're still going to fight. And I think that's just so freaking awesome. I love that in anything. Any film, any, story, when they do that, I find that awesome. And then you have Aragorn bringing in just everyone who's left, the final force, just to the black gates of Mordor to draw away Sauron's gaze from Frodo, to give him more time. And his plan is just to give Frodo more time. And he knows that they're not going to survive, but he does it anyway, to give them more time. And that's just so fantastic. It's just, I love that. Just continuing to fight, despite the odds being overwhelmingly against them. I love that. I always have. And I think that's fantastic. I love that. They did that so well in this film. And then it just has so many impressive shots. And this film's scale is just so large and impressive. It has some of the most striking imagery and, in my opinion, memorable imagery from this entire trilogy. Like the city of Minas Tirith and then Minas Morgul and, just the entirety of Mordor, which is definitely drawing on Tolkien's experience from World War I. The whole, landscape of Mordor looks exactly like, the battlefield of World War I. So that influence is very much there. That is obviously intentional. But it just has so much striking imagery. Like when you look at the entrance to Mount Doom and, the overlook of the lava inside, it's almost like a dark reflection of Minas Tirith with that, cliff jutting out from the center. It's very similar in its imagery. It almost looks like a miniature version of Minas Tirith. It's just cool. It just has so much striking imagery, and it's so impressive on that level, because I can't tell in this film whether or not certain shots are CGI or if they're practical. And that's just so impressive to me. I think a lot of them were models and miniatures, but in some shots it might have been CGI. I can't tell. It's so well done and so well blended that I just can't tell. And the film just balances everything perfectly. All the separate storylines and plot elements are balanced perfectly. They're always cutting back to them, and you never feel like you're missing a certain part of the story. I've seen a lot of people complaining about that in Two Towers, like whenever there's the scenes with Treebeard, they feel like it draws the attention away from the more exciting stuff. As I said in my previous video, that stuff never bothered me, but I can understand as a film why that's bothersome. But Return of the King doesn't have that as a film. Like, everything about it is immaculately constructed, and it's just perfectly paced, which is crazy, because the version, I should say, of this film that I watched was the extended cut, and that is 4 hours long, and it feels perfectly paced. It never feels like it's dragging on or anything. It never feels like scenes linger more than necessary. It's just a perfectly paced movie, and I think that goes for the theatrical cut and the extended cut, which is crazy. Because with both of the previous films and their extended releases, I could understand why certain elements were cut from the theatrical release to benefit the pacing of the film. But with this film, I feel like even with the extended cut, the pacing is perfect. Like, it's just such a well-constructed movie in really, like, every regard. And there are just so many great moments of payoff and just small moments that show, Tolkien's message that he was trying to portray throughout these films. Like, when Aragorn charges into battle at the Black Gate, and who are the first people that follow him into battle? It's Merry and Pippin, the hobbits, the smallest people. And that goes back to Tolkien's thesis, Gandalf's quote from the first Hobbit film, "It's the small things that keep evil at bay." And then you just have Gandalf's speech to Pippin, where, Pippin says, "I didn't think it would end like this." And then Gandalf says, "This is not the end. Death is just another path, one that we all must take." It's such a beautiful scene, and I think it's wonderful. I think, there's so many great moments of payoff, individual moments, that I just can't mention every single one of them, but there are more that I'm forgetting. It's just such a well-done film in every regard. Like, technically, it's so impressive to me. And, I feel like it just reaches this level of, I'm going to say it, epicness that modern movies nowadays I feel can only hope to achieve, and I feel like they never will. And then, the conclusion to this film, I could not imagine being any better. There is the element of it where they cut out the whole scouring of the Shire plotline, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, where Saruman takes over the Shire. But that doesn't bother me because they still show the significance and the scars that this journey and this war, I suppose, has left on our characters. Because the main purpose of that event in the book was to show that even once the war is over, evil is never fully extinguished. Even though the ultimate threat has been extinguished, it's never truly gone. And evil festers in, the very places that we consider to be home. And I like that element, but I feel like they still have that element of things never being the same again. Like Frodo's injury that he received on Weathertop in the first film still hurts him, and that means that he can't stay. He must go to the White Shores. And once they return to the Shire, they sit down in that pub, the same place they were in at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, and they have their beers, but something doesn't feel the same. Like, the charm of the Shire just isn't clicking with them the same way that it used to. And for me, that is enough. The whole scouring of the Shire thing would have just added another big event to the film that people, wouldn't see coming. It would have been a cool twist, I suppose. But I feel like as a film, the conclusion works well, and I can't imagine it being any better. They still show the impact that the journey has had on them, and that nothing is ever truly the same for our characters. And, just Frodo Frodo leaving, Frodo going to the White Shores, and the scene where he just says farewell to all of his companions, and Bilbo is the first one to board the ship. I feel like that's also very significant because he's the first character that we met, right, in the Hobbit. So he is the first one to board the ship. I feel like that's very important. And it's just such an emotional scene, and it makes me tear up every time. I feel like if it doesn't make you tear up, you're like soulless. The hobbits are crying, and I'm crying. It's such an emotional scene, but I can't imagine them drawing this series to an end in a better way than that. And before Frodo leaves, he hands Sam the book, and I've talked about this in the past. I love endings that leave you on that note of being able to continue the story. Frodo gives him the book that started with Bilbo, that he continued, and that he is now passing to Sam, and he says, the last pages are for you. You can continue the story. And I always love stories that end like that. I find that very powerful. Like I mentioned that in my top 10 movies of 2019 or whatever a couple years ago, where I was talking about How to Train Your Dragon 3 and why at that point in time it was my favorite film of that year. And I said that it ends on a similar note to The Return of the King, with, the dragons leaving, but with that note of hopefulness that they can return in the future. But you're not going to see that. You can continue the story yourself. And I love that, because it's basically like your life is the rest of the story. And I love that. Like, Sam gets to continue the story, and in a way that's him passing on this legendary tale to you and saying you get to continue the story. And I find that so powerful, and I can't imagine this series drawing to a close better than the way it was executed in this film. Now, I'm going to say something here that may surprise you, and that is that objectively, I honestly think The Two Towers is a better film. The Two Towers is great, and The Return of the King is also great. But I would say, as an individual film, The Two Towers is better. It has its own, beginning, middle, and end, and I feel like as its own self-contained narrative, it works better than The Return of the King. The Return of the King is also, in a way, its own self-contained narrative, but it does tie up all the loose ends from this series, even from the Hobbit films, and in that regard, there are certain parts of it that can feel a little bit more messy than the prior film. So I would say that objectively, I think The Two Towers is a better film, but subjectively, this is my favorite film of the trilogy. And it's so personal to me. This film is so special to me in every regard, and it's such a special story to me, and it's always been a part of my life, really. Like, growing up, I think I've watched this when I was like 4 or something. You know, it's always, The Lord of the Rings has always been a part of my life, and this film has always been a part of my life, and looking back on it now and seeing just how good it truly is very inspiring to me, and this whole series is very inspiring to me. I love the story of these films and of these books as well, and yeah, that is why The Return of the King is my favorite film of all time, and I'm really glad that I was able to share this experience with you guys, you know, revisiting these films and talking about them with you guys, because, you know, this channel is called Hobbricks, and I haven't made a lot of Middle-earth or Hobbit-related videos in a long time, and I really wanted to do that, and I wanted to bring back what I feel the core of this channel is meant to be, and I'm glad that I was able to bring you guys this series, and I feel these videos turned out as well as I could have hoped they would be. You know, I feel like I did as good as I could with this series, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it and listening to it just as much as I did making it. And with that said, that's pretty much all I have to say here about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, this entire series, this epic series, which is so special to me. It's about all I have to say about it. So, with all that said, you guys please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.